those things all over the world. ZICS's been in existence for well over 30 years now, and this particular session is in a way the spirit of ICSI. It at a critical time, which is thinking about COVID-19 and what we can learn from it beyond. It brings together three other international organizations in the global space who have really been making a very active contribution to this debate. Many organizations have the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, technology companies, foundations, philanthropies, all of these. And today we have three of these organizations and communities that have come together to help us think about what is and what should the world look like beyond COVID-19, and what have we been learning that can help us contribute to that debate. So we will hear in turn from the following people. First of all, in a few moments, we will hear from Team OECD. We will hear from Beatrice Pont, Romain Vianney, and they are both policy analysts, senior policy analysts, education policy analysts at the OECD. We will then hear from Team Unicef, from Robert Jenkins, Janet Lennox, Nicolas Ruga, who are Chief of Education, Knowledge Manager, and Senior Advisor, respectively. And finally, we'll hear from Team ARC. And the ARC Education Project we'll hear from the director of that project, Trista Holwick, and the dean of the faculty where the project sits, which is Richard Barwell. We have two questions here. We'll hear everybody in response to the first question, then have a little bit of interaction, and then we'll hear everybody again once more in relation to the second question and have a little bit of interaction around that. And so first, I would like to move us now. We have 26 participants, which is great, over to Team OECD. Away you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. And thank you very much, everybody. It's here. I'm Beatrice Pont, and I'm here with my colleague, Romain Vianney. We both work in leading change team at the OECD, and we're going to present some findings, I think, based on the work that we do. So the project that we run is actually doing comparative analysis and peer learning and tailored country support in implementation. So we're really working and helping countries make change happen on the ground, which often is very distant. And I don't know how many of you were in the keynote today where we were exploring the policy practice gap, and it is a little bit of what we will be talking about today. So we see in the next slide, the main what's our main question that we're exploring for the first 5 minutes? What lessons can be learned from the education response to the COVID-19 crisis that really enabled children to continue to learn? And we see I'm going to give you OECD data as much as we have been able to gather. And where are we now, actually? And what we see is that most countries who have been able to have prioritized reopening schools in OECD countries, and that's on the right-hand side where most countries are delivering school on-site rather than hybrid or rather than fully remote. And even today in the UK, they are starting back up to school. And I think this has been quite a success in highlighting the important value that school has for our societies, for our children. And it has really put schools in the center of our societies. And I think that's quite a win situation for what COVID has brought us to reveal. In the next slide, we'll see that when policymakers had to prioritize what to focus on, and we see from this survey that happened in the first wave that the first priority was really learning, but actually there were many others. And the first was to provide professional support to teachers, to ensure the continuity of assessment of student learning, but also especially the social development of children, well-being of students, and well-being of teachers as well, and engaging parents, and also supporting disadvantaged students. So this has been one of the bigger lessons as well from COVID, that there has been a greater focus on needing, or focus on finding out that equity was even more of a priority than it used to be before. And COVID has shown this, and policymakers, if you see in the next slide, actually, when they were asked, what are you planning for the next steps? Many, more than, in all the, what were they planning to do? They said that many were going to assess gaps in student learning, introduce remedial measures to make sure that student learning gaps were covered, but also more than 60% said that they would focus on disadvantaged students and making sure that these students would have the means necessary to go back to learning. So equity has been a key policy priority for many countries. And we see in the next slide as well that one of the other outcomes of COVID has been that in the first wave, when asked, this is a survey undertaken by the OECD and Harvard early on in the COVID pandemic, and they asked, during the period when students could not attend school, how were they taught the school curriculum? Who did it? Who made it happen? And actually, more than half said that it was actually schools that made their own alternative education arrangements without government. So again, here are schools prioritizing learning, taking action quickly. 1 week after the pandemic hit, they're already back in school or trying to deliver learning to their students in any way possible. And in a way, this shows that policy was lagging behind. And this is a key finding, actually, that highlights the professionalism of schools, of teachers, and of school leaders, and how quickly they got back up on their feet, and how policy was running behind, actually trying to shape the right environment. And in the next slide, we see some of the policy responses that countries adopted. And there's a wide variety, and they really depend on the context of what was happening in each country. You don't really see any one that is similar, but you see, for example, Japan, who set up a human resource bank for supporting schools and children. Chile, which promoted student-centered conferences between teachers, parents, and students, or Ireland, who advises schools to plan for more collaborative learning. So they're introducing resources for training, for support, for all kinds of, for IT. You see very varied responses. And in the next slide, you also see other responses for the disadvantaged or for curriculum and learning. In Chile, for example, introduced curricular prioritization for schools, or Portugal, who introduced an action plan, asking schools to develop an action plan for the recovery and consolidation of learning, or England funding education catch-up activities, or Wales introducing, recruiting new and extra teachers to support what was happening. So we've seen many different actions around, and also that schools have had the opportunity to innovate, to become more autonomous, and to demonstrate how important they were and they are in delivering education. And this is where I stop, because that's my 5 minutes. And I introduce now Robert, please.
Thanks a lot, Beatrice. And let me begin my name's Robert Jenkins. I'm the Global Chief of Education for Unicef, and just thank Trista and Andy for this partnership with ARC and also with Beatrice. And I'm just really happy to be here. Let me also thank Nicola and Janet, my colleagues at Unicef, who are very much close partners in pulling this presentation together. We've learned a lot collectively, all of us, on responding to the pandemic and the disruption caused by the pandemic. And I just want to support everything that Beatrice said, and she's covered a lot of the ground. Let me just move to the next slide. And I want to just take a second and sort of provide a snapshot, if you'd like, and a couple of case studies. We have seen that countries that had pre-invested in multiple learning pathways and resilient education systems, in more dynamic ways of delivering curriculums and engaging with parents, have weathered this pandemic better, definitely not by any means spared by the disruption, but better. And I guess that's in a sense a truism or is an obvious statement, but what does that look like in practice? We have, for example, Egypt has made long-term investments dating back many years, but more recently, since about 2017, in something called Education 2.0. It focused on improved connectivity. It provided different forms of technology in classrooms and linking classrooms to households and to students. And it also more recently has adopted the learning passport also, and this covers a wide range of the curriculum. And you can see from those earlier investments, but also how they responded to the pandemic, the results in terms of children continue in their learning along their learning pathway during this disruption. Jordan, another great example, a whole wide range of very proactive, innovative ways of reaching children with remote learning, but also incorporating those lessons into the planning and implementation of the recovery process that's very much ongoing now. And some very interesting data around how children have managed to maintain their learning and now are accelerating their learning. I just want to flag Uruguay often comes up in many different forms, many conversations. Of course, a very famous proactive country in terms of its education using technology and otherwise. And it's one of the, if not, I think the shortest, the country with the shortest closure of schools in the entire Latin South American region. Zimbabwe has adopted a number of different modalities to reach children, and that also will soon launch the learning passport as part of the recovery process, but have also supported teachers in delivering learning materials to households while schools were disrupted, all the way through using radio, television, and other technologies. So a very wide range. So just a few snapshots of examples of innovation at scale to enable children to continue remote learning, but also in sort of incorporating these innovations into the recovery and reopening of schools. In the next slide, what is interesting is this is hopefully not too difficult to see, but what the point of this slide is to show you that the proactiveness of countries and of education systems in reaching children with remote learning, in this case with accelerated programming and catch-up programming, does not correlate with income. Let me say that again. The high-income countries, maybe you'd expect to have been more proactive, to have provided more ways of enabling children to accelerate and catch up their learning. That is not the case. In actual fact, the inverse seems to be more the case, which is low-income countries, middle-income countries are proving to be more innovative in the accelerated programs and the catch-up programs and enabling children to regain from this disruption. So the last slide is, let me just throw out some ideas that Janet and Nicola and I have, with others, have been brainstorming around. Why is it some countries, some education systems are in such a wide variety of performance in terms of providing remote learning opportunities, but also to recover and incorporate innovations into the school systems as they recover? There's obviously a political will and a leadership element to that. Political will meaning overall at decision-making level, beyond education, within the education sector, but leadership within the education sector has proven critical and correlates with performance. Risk tolerance, or if you'd like, sort of being scientific, follow the science, follow the evidence, and engage with the health and scientific community when making education decisions has been critical. We've seen all over the world, and those countries which have done that have obviously succeeded better than those who have not. And the previous investments and enabling earlier actions so that school systems are resilient, are dynamic, and therefore able to adjust accordingly. Those are just some ideas I'd like to share with the group. Thanks again.
All right. So I am going to share now a little bit about our ARC Education project. And the ARC Education project is located at the University of Ottawa, which Andy has shared with you earlier. But unlike UNICEF and the OECD, we might need to take a moment to explain what we are. So we are a social movement, and a collective that advances equity, broad excellence, inclusion, well-being, democracy, sustainability, and human rights in high-quality, professionally run systems. And the idea for ARC is, as a professional learning network, we bring together systems. So seven systems, including 2 Canadian provinces and a global member of the ICP, to promote improvement, innovation, inclusion. And this is a 6th year in existence. And the pandemic normally would have us in a face-to-face summit, was changed as the pandemic happened and moved us into the virtual space. And we introduced a new format to gather. And there was a feeling that really, as a professional learning community, we needed to come together to learn from one another. And the Thought Meet series was born. And the Thought Meet series brings together thought leaders such as Beatrice and Rob, who has come to present for us, and have the different systems engaging in their own thinking. And one of the key elements of the Thought Meet series that it really is around Chatham House rules. So it is not a public conversation. It is the members of the different communities who come together, representatives from government, representatives from professional associations like teachers unions and principals associations, to talk about urgent problems and such as COVID-19. You can find a lot on our website if interested. So the lessons learned from our group really were a focus on equity, and Beatrice highlighted that in her presentation. And for us as well, it was the needs of students, especially in remote areas, and some of the innovative ways that systems were able to reach out and support different students. For example, in Nova Scotia, one of our systems, they were using the newsletter flyers system. So they were able to already use a system that was in place to deliver learning packets to students who didn't have connectivity and internet access. And then also thinking about the broadcasting on professional networks, how you can bring the television and use telephone systems, TV to support the learning for students. Iceland also was using the national broadcasting educational systems. So equity was a major issue, and is one that continues to be on the forefront of our guiding questions as we move forward. Learning and assessment. So most of the systems canceled national assessments. And what does that mean for learning? How does learning look? Could learning look different than in a school context? Those are the questions that were raised and challenged. Where does play fit in? Outdoor education, thinking about the roles for students of learning happening. And one of the areas really interesting that links to the third one as well is Uruguay, who Rob mentioned, also had a lot of community work. So connecting with the parents, the communities, bringing them into the schools. How do you connect them through the apps and the different technology tools? So that was a great learning on how we can start thinking about schooling and the relationships beyond the school walls, so having parents and family and community involved. Leadership and autonomy. We talked a lot at the beginning about imperfect leadership, the idea of making decisions, but also thinking how do we use that leadership and autonomy for the schools, for the different associations. Some of the teachers were talking about how the freedom happened for them away from the stress of the PISA, and now focus more on the learning that was happening, and that they were doing learning in a different way. So the autonomy for teachers. And again, a focus on well-being. This is coming up often in the sessions that we have. It's the awareness that well-being for teachers, for leaders, for parents, for students is really an interest and a focus for moving forward and throughout the last while. So I have a few, you can't really read this, but this is an example of the type of snapshots that are shared amongst the different systems and what's happening. So I spoke about the Nova Scotia using the newspaper flyer systems, and sharing what has been happening while in innovation between the different systems has been important and available on the Thought Meet web pages if you're interested. For Wales, sharing some of these key principles for reopening schools, connecting to learning what's happening elsewhere, so that when we're talking about leaders making decisions, they can make decisions that work best for them in their context, always thinking what we can learn and how do we apply it locally, and keeping the communication amongst all the key members at the forefront. Uruguay shared the great connectivity, and Robert talked about that in his presentation, but that a gap really was happening in terms of the private and the public schools, especially so everybody was able to access the technology, but how they were using it was where the gap started to surface. So that adaptability and the thinking through well-being. There was a qualitative survey that was released when they're starting to look at teacher well-being. And so Uruguay's moved forward and has a 24/7 call line for teacher well-being that's being supported. So these are some of the ideas and lessons learned that are shared amongst the different systems through this community. I'm going to pass it over. Oh, I have one more, sorry, the Iceland, the idea too that the mention of the stress that they had before, and now they had this discursive shift where teachers were seen as really essential workers and had the trust in the system to carry out the learning plans, and the idea this was really important for them, and with inclusion as a key element in the Icelandic curriculum, that the smaller class sizes were really helpful for teachers to be able to meet the needs for students. So this was one of the key lessons learned during the time, how important that is, the smaller class sizes for students and accessing their needs during this time. I'm going to turn it over to Andy. Andy, are you able to access?
Yeah, I needed to unmute. Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you for that, Trista. We're getting some great chats going on alongside at the same time. So the question is now is the second question is, and we'll go through the same order again. What lessons can be drawn from the response to COVID-19? To inform the recovery of education systems after COVID. So we've been thinking about how people have been responding during the pandemic. Now we're really trying to focus on what we will learn that will last perhaps forever afterwards. So could we go through the same process again, please, if we'd like to start with Team OECD?
Thank you. I feel like I was speed dating here very quickly. We're speaking very fast, so I'm going to speak slower, but we'll maintain in my 5 minutes. I think you've all presented very relevant examples of how countries have been tackling, providing policy responses. And one of the key issues is how was this done? And what type of strategies they implement, and what can we learn from them? And what we see in the first wave, actually, when in the same survey that I referred to before, people said everybody was very happy with the decision-making process. Everybody did everything they could do to help. It was designed collaboratively, including teachers. Everybody agreed. It was well planned, it was well executed, and probably this is the first wave. I think more as we move forward into the next slide, we see also that actually what did happen with all these strategies. And one of the issues is what was the focus of the strategies? What was the policy focus? When you look at learning, many have talked about the gap, the learning gap, and we see actually in two surveys, the one from the OECD and one that I recently found from McKinsey, that they were asking, on the left more a different range of education stakeholders, and more than half said that students learned, but less than they would have at school during the first wave. And in the second and the right, McKinsey asked teachers internationally whether they thought that they were learning as much as they were learning before. And many teachers said that at least on average, they were 2 months behind where they usually would have been in early November without having COVID. Now, what's important is what is the focus and what teachers had to focus not only on learning, but also on well-being, on equity, and on being able to deliver in a new technological environment, being able to survive themselves in their own lives, and working together, learning pedagogically how to deliver education. So it was very challenging. So measuring impact, what do you measure actually? Do you measure only learning, or do you measure so many other things? If we go to the next slide, so this is one of the aspects. The other aspect, which is very positive, is what were the unexpected positive education results from the changes? And actually many people highlighted a number of them, including, introducing technologies. It would have taken 10 years, 15 years to do what happened in 3 weeks had it not been for COVID. Actually, we introduced technology, we tested it out, we ran through it, we piloted it, it worked, it didn't work, but it was something that was quite an opportunity that wouldn't have been the case. It would have had so many people against introducing any kind of piloting. It would have never gotten off the ground. It also gave more autonomy to teachers and to students in their own learning. And it strengthened the involvement of and cooperation with parents, making it, students, schools, and parents, which is what we should have actually normally. So this was strengthened as well during COVID. And it also, many people highlighted that it improved multi-sectorial cooperation, including health and education and others, where it would have been so difficult to get people together to think about something in a school unless COVID came through and pushed this. And very importantly, it increased pedagogical autonomy of teachers. And this is the professionalization of teachers and the greater external support and understanding of the vital role of teachers in learning. So all of this actually has made it quite important and quite relevant for what next in the future. So if we move to the next slide, we can see, well, how can we, this was, all of these innovations were more at the school level. How do we now move? And I was talking this morning about this policy practice gap where we were looking, I had a teacher, I said, okay, so the policymakers were doing this, but what did really happen in the classroom? And we found this very large gap between the reality and the jargon that we use in policy, including myself, I can say, but many others. And so how to bridge this gap so that policy really reaches schools, and in times of COVID, it's very important to close this gap quickly. So we've seen, in terms of students, schools have, education systems have moved to school and closed schools, open schools, introduced remote learning and all kinds of hybrid approaches, focus on learning and well-being to mitigate risks for the disadvantaged. In terms of education professionals and schools overall, we've seen so much flexibility and adaptability in teachers and leaders, so much more collaboration and an investment in professional competencies and skills, whether it was individuals or the school system delivering that. And at the system level, we've seen more and more investments in resources in ICT, in capacity, hopefully in promoting networks, but also a big issue on how to measure how to assess student knowledge. And that's something that's still not very well developed in many education systems, but they're working through how to do that. And this will have an impact in the future as well. And so there is an important lesson that came through is that, and that I've highlighted before, that with more autonomy, more professionalization comes a new role for education policy, which is to really, to give the priority to schools, trust the teachers, and actually education policy to set the right infrastructure and the right support structures so that schools can be trusted to do what they know how to do best, which is to teach students and to prioritize the school community. So overall, we think that, and this is a framework that we present, Roman and I often in implementation, that what's important is to think these policies through from an implementation perspective and weave in schools at the heart of whatever needs to be done next, prioritizing them and making sure that policy is not leading, but is actually supporting schools to do what they can do best. And I would stop here and give the word to Robert, please. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Beatrice. So in terms of moving forward, we see some short-term actions and taking from lessons from other countries and sort of best practices, and then long-term, or just a couple of slides. On the short term, and actually I think if you look at these, and none of it will seem new or different, I think the pandemic and the disruption of the pandemic has given us an opportunity to spotlight these, given us an opportunity to accelerate a lot. What Beatrice has just mentioned too, I think an ongoing change process has accelerated. So the four we would like to share is, one, the importance of targeting in back to school campaigns, proactively reaching the most marginalized children within communities, understanding the barriers they face, and proactively overcoming those. Those could be gender related, particularly for older children, maybe related to barriers that disabled children face, the children that are learning in a language that's not offered in the curriculum, poor children in remote communities. But every community will be different. Every community will need to proactively understand those barriers and proactively overcome them. We've heard a lot about in the press, study after study, about the impact of the pandemic has had and school closures have had on children's mental health and psychosocial needs are now particularly acute, but also the impact of school closures have on school meals and nutritional support, other forms of health support. And so as schools are reopening and planning for that reopening, the importance of providing for children's overall well-being. Now, again, the third point was a best practice well before the disruption of the pandemic, but particularly important now as children come back into school and re-engage with schools and their classroom, to undertake an assessment of where children are, catch them where they are in their learning, and enable differentiated pathways for each child. Investing in people, and obviously education is an example of where people throughout the system feel adequately supported and are adequately supported. And one of the important tools will be technology, but far beyond technology, the importance of teacher professional development and enabling communities of practice, etc., so that all people within the system, children, teachers, administrators, etc., adequately supported. Now, in the second slide, my next slide is just on the longer term. We've learned a lot about the importance of planning and budgeting. We are very concerned about education resources around the world and the public levels of public investment in education, recognizing the constraints governments are currently facing. It's something we're engaging with very intensely all around the world. The investing over the long term in alternative dynamic pathways and platforms. A couple of points on this slide. Again, seeing systems that have multiple pathways, multiple ways of learning, complementing both in-class and blended approaches have proven to be more resilient during this disruption. Partnerships is an overwhelming theme. Partners at the global level, as illustrated by this panel, but all the way through partnerships at community level between parents and teachers, schools and communities. And we have seen, at least I have been reassured by the intensity and the breadth of those partnerships. And I think by a growing appreciation of how fundamental and central schools play in community life and in a child's life, how new and innovative partners have come to the table and are now engaging. Then the last thing I'll just mention is data around learning, data around which children are learning what and how are systems performing at the various levels, and how do we learn from the evidence and from the data to enable best practices to be taken up across systems, system-wide, but also across countries. And this idea of real-time monitoring, so that we don't, we avoid the sort of comprehensive long-term survey and then digest that and then report, make a big report, and then it comes back, but rather into a system. But can we enable real-time monitoring so that immediate action is taken right at the classroom level around the child to enable them to reach their full potential? Thanks again for this opportunity. I think I'm passing to you, Tristan, now.
Yep,
I think
that's
back.
me. That's me
Yeah.
now. So, and it's really fun to listen to our partners at the OECD and also at UNICEF. So many similarities that we're seeing in our lessons that we can learn moving forward. So as you were just talking about, Rob, the value of schools really is so central. Technology is an excellent tool for pedagogical support, but the value of the face-to-face interactions, and that schools offer students so much more, and that is what's missing. And parents, our ICP members talked about how parents are so grateful to teachers, and this new appreciation for the work that schools do has something to capitalize on as we move forward. And also the idea of professional learning for teachers was also mentioned. How do we support that? And one of the elements that came up from our systems is that teachers are looking for professional learning in a different way moving forward. No longer will it be the professional development that has to happen on the same day. We've been able to access during this the pandemic all sorts of different places and opportunities. So to be able to explore how that looks across different schools and CPD will be very different moving forward. The investment in partnerships, and partnerships like ARC has been highlighted as one of the key elements. Where is a space where people can learn and network in a way that it really brings up some issues and learn from one another in a way that you can say what's really happening. It's not only in the public sphere and noted. So there's an element of that confidentiality and partnership and networking for system leaders, but also within systems, the collaboration, and then also with community. And the pieces of collaboration and communication, and making sure that the schools and system leaders are also aware of the information and how challenging that has been when it is not shared at the same time. So if they're not included in the information, it's not a united and comprehensive decision. Has been something to keep thinking about as we move forward. Collective responsibility and autonomy within each of the different partners. So autonomy for schools, the innovation for systems. School meals are an issue. So how, Nova Scotia used local restaurants to provide school meals. That's something, using innovative strategies, and how do we continue to build those partnerships moving forward? And the autonomy of teachers, really helping teachers feel the trust that we have in them, especially as assessments have changed. And so the role for teachers' professional learning, teachers' professional assessments, and voice is critical. One of the areas to continue to work on lessons learned is where are the student voices and where are the teacher voices, and making sure that that's being heard in a lot of our data gathering and our communications. And providing a critical space, and this idea ARC is really seeing itself as a movement around guiding principles, but figuring from the bottom up, how do we implement and share and promote and advocate for ideas like outdoor learning? One of the challenges we want to make is to this idea of learning lost. So rather focusing on some of the strengths and some of the options, where's play, where's outdoor learning, where's the role of nature? How do we move that into the priority as we worry about learning that may be missing? So where have students been learning in a new and different way? So from some of our partners here, ICP is talking about celebrating these new skills. So as we're talking about the self-directed learning of students and problem solving, that there was some learning that was, so they said after 3 months that there's some progress. Students are feeling that there is progress being made, but teachers are using different learning tools, different topics than they would in a face-to-face, and they're adapting as they move forward. And focusing on the strengths and the danger of imposing what Blake calls the mind-forged manacles on our students. We emphasize the deficit rather than the strengths. So where can we start changing the discussion and focusing on some of the strengths as we go forward? In Iceland, it is important to remember vocational learning, play. I think as we come off of the celebration for Sir Ken Robinson, who was one of the ARC members, creativity, innovation, the arts, play, outdoors. How do we find a way out of COVID, and by celebrating some of the other ways of learning and subjects? How do we define the competencies that we need? And then the idea of assessment tools. How do we find different types of assessment tools now that these national exams have been canceled? And how do we continue to use different assessment tools as we move forward? I'm going to stop the share there. I think we're at the point, Andy, now for you to share some of the chat. I haven't been able to follow it, but I'll leave that to you, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you, Trista, and thank you everyone for these, in a very short space of time, to offer such incredible clarity and insight about the moment we're in globally, and from global organizations with complementary mandates to see what this looks like. We've learned a lot, I think, through these. I'll just mention about 4 things. First, particularly from Robert's paper, from the Unicef paper, that just like in business, the most innovative ideas often don't come from the biggest systems. So we know from Clayton Christensen's, I can't even say it properly, Clayton Christensen's terrific book on the innovator's dilemma, which first brought the idea of disruptive innovation into the world, that it's not IBM who invents the laptop and the Palm Top. It's the people who get frustrated at IBM because IBM thinks it knows how to do everything, and go off somewhere else and start a little startup and begin with different insights. And I think in the field of change generally, we're coming to realize that some of the most powerful ideas we need for moving forward in the world are not amongst those countries and cultures and economies that have been most dominant over the last 40 years, but among those who are emerging from the global south and the east, and not only now from the global north and west. So this is something that I think we've really learned during this pandemic that is so desperately important. I think a second thing is what is it that changes teaching and learning? What are the transformational forces? If we look in recent years at both research and policy, and I think Beatrice alluded to this, more than alluded to it, if a Martian came down, if Martians decided to come to Earth and make a decision about is there life on Earth, never mind is there life on Mars, then a Martian might say, well, if you look at education, it looks like the experts think that they should make the decisions and the teachers should implement them. And so, for example, the biggest prize in research in education is the Yeadam Prize of $4 million. If you look collectively at who the Yeadam Prize has gone to in its first 3 years of operation, it's gone to people whose expertise is in metadata and metadata analysis, people whose expertise is in neurons and brain science, and people whose expertise is in laboratory psychology and in blind control studies in laboratory psychology. You'd imagine collectively that from this prize for the world's best educational research, there's nothing to learn from teachers, from classrooms, from schools, from the field itself. And I think, Beatrice, until about 10 years ago, when the OECD started to become interested in strong performers, successful reformers, you'd have said the same about the OECD. But over the last 10 years, and particularly now, during this natural experiment, what all these papers have done has shown how much there is to learn from what people actually do in actual places in their practice, and not only what goes on in the neurons of people's heads, in the experiments in laboratories, and in the metadata in somebody's statistical lab. And this incredible and horrible natural experiment that we've been in has been astonishing, I think, for how it's brought up from the bottom things that we really need to think about in policy and respond to, rather than having experts, corporate, scientific, political, from the top, deciding what is best for teachers and then finding ways to implement it. I think that's the second thing. There's two more. The third is around technology. So before COVID, and even during the early stages of COVID, and among some people still during COVID, there was a kind of irrational exuberance about the power of digital technology to transform education. In the early days of COVID, I heard it in discussions I was involved in with the Brookings Institute, the IADB, the World Bank. Technology that actually in terms of Beatrice's table, even though it was at the top of the table, Beatrice, actually it was kind of the least progressive of all the things that people thought had an impact. And probably you might want to think about switching that table upside down, because if you look at it really fast, you think that it's been the technology that's been the most progressive. But actually it was people. It was people that looked like it was the place we should really be looking at. And Rob, you talked about people alongside technology as well. So I think before COVID, we lived in a world of irrational exuberance amongst politicians and technology corporations about the power of technology to transform learning, and perhaps an irrational lack of exuberance amongst teachers' organizations about the horror and the tragedy of technology as a way of thinking about teaching. And now I think we're in a new space where almost every teacher in many countries in the world is at least proficient with technology. And we can have a new discussion about how we bring people and technology together to move education forward and not put them apart from each other. I think that's the last thing in not forever, but for today in these presentations. If we'd have had a fourth transnational organization involved here, which is Education International, the Union of Unions, which has 32 million members across the world, they would have said, and many of their member unions would have said, that, and the ICP has said, that one thing they've learned during this pandemic is however much teachers were already collaborating before, they're actually collaborating more now. And this is not just true of teachers, but this is true, as Trista was describing, of other organizations, other partners as well. So we've built probably tremendous social capital during this pandemic. And the really important thing of all the things that all the papers described is that we don't squander what it is that we've actually built during this period when we breathe a sigh of relief, go out dancing again, travel on public transport again and think that we can get back to normal in everything, including exactly how schools used to be. So a lot to learn from these papers, and a lot to learn about the future as well. And now I'd like, in the last 10 minutes, to open this for discussion, either in the chat, or we know you're out there and we can even see some of you, even face to face as well. So if you could signal a hand, and then Tristan and I will look on the gallery for your hand up if you have a virtual hand up, or you can put something in the chat. And if you could help me, Trista, here, that would be great.
I believe Richard has a question. Richard, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Well, I mean, and it kind of takes up some of what Andy just talked about. But, you know, behind all of, I was thinking about when Beatrice was talking about the benefits, the positives that have come out of the pandemic, and all of the papers, in fact, address this. And it set me wondering, you know, so should next time we feel like our systems are getting stuck, should we prescribe a pandemic to get us out of it? So maybe that's a bit extreme, but you know, there's something about the blind spots in our theories of change in education in the past that maybe the pandemic is it's an opportunity to notice. Oh, okay, there are blind spots here, and we can actually rethink some of how we understand and theorize change in education for the future.
Yeah, does anyone respond of the three presenters or the three teams want to respond to Richard's question?
Well, to me, I could just jump in by saying, I'm wondering if it was a blind spot. I mean, we were all very aware of the global learning crisis before the pandemic. You know, report after report, study after study, conference after conference. I'm wondering what it actually has had now is the one way of looking at the impact of the disruption of the pandemic has been the incentives to actually change, to take what it's not that it was blind spot, it was just now indeed it's overwhelming demand for change by youth, by children, by parents all over the world. And I think that overwhelming demand is now also reaching decision makers. The reality is we're not going to, at least in the 145 countries that Unicef works, we see a whole wide range of levels of adoption of this ambition to change at scale, from a complete transformation and a leapfrog to the future within weeks, to the school systems are going to open up and be the same old underperforming school systems that closed before the pandemic. So now the key is just going to be, how do we bring up the floor to reach all countries, ultimately all children. Maybe the last thing I'm going to say is on this is, you know, the voices of marginalized children, the spotlight has been shown on these disparities. Again, that wasn't a blind spot. Everyone knew that, but now it's almost just so acute, it can't be ignored anymore. And that's something I'm also very inspired by.
So if I could just follow up on that quickly, do we believe that the changes awaiting us in particularly public education, but of course all education, will be as great as many people are thinking they should be in care homes for seniors in the developed economies? Is the level, is the call to action in a way as intense in those two areas?
Maybe
Beatrice.
I can intervene, but I won't fully respond this question, but the previous one about, you know, for the future and the change. And I think
And theories of change, yeah.
yes, one of the issues is that everybody's talking of going back to normal, and we shouldn't go back. We cannot go back. I mean, it's physically, metaphysically impossible to go back. But many people want the certainty, the sureness of going back to schools as it was. And I hope that it will never be as it was, and that we have learned from, you know, the unexpected and positive that have come through from COVID. And I think that the change is what you were highlighting, that it is, we have to give such a wider space to schools to lead, and leading from the middle and leading schools, and what does policy have to do? And they have to trust and set the right, I think still we need to measure, we need to provide comparative, you know, peer learning opportunities and data. It's still very important because it really helps us, but I will stop here, and I wanted to also give the opportunity for Roman, my co-author, to also join, for her to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Just a couple more points, because obviously we have very similar conclusions in response to what Beatrice just said, but maybe just one point that we should highlight, as we're actually seeing in action today. We can already see that education systems are drawing lessons from what's happening. So I don't think that if there were still any blind spots, they could be ignored anymore, along with the fact that both the youth, but teachers as well, with this newfound or reinforced autonomy that they've experienced, they would not let that pass. They would not let it go back to normal. So hopefully, next time there's a need for change, there won't be a need for a pandemic, Richard, as you said. But just a couple more points about the trust and support that education systems, or more than that, system leaders really need to start turning into reality, because it's true that we've seen a lot of speeches around tackling the emergency together, and a couple of things that we see are needed, at least from our team's perspective, is that as the schools reopen and as new lessons are learned from this almost 1 year of pandemic, the dialogue between both the profession through teacher unions and through other more informal channels, as well as the reinforcement of student voice, is a central concern and should be a central concern for system leaders. And there's some interesting examples that can be drawn from several countries. I'll stop there, but if I can redirect you to maybe the OECD's COVID-19 hub platform, there's a lot of examples of policy responses along those lines that can help with trust moving forward.
And just I'll pull up, I know we only have a minute left, but just I tend to live and dwell in a space of possibility and hope. And so it is, you know, with hope that we will take these lessons that we've learned and consider, but you need action. It can't just be lessons learned on a slide. So how do we provide these spaces where system leaders can connect with the people who are doing the work in the schools, that we can have collaboration and collective autonomy that's alive and moving us forward? How do we provide that? That has to be actionable, and it has to be lessons learned to be a catalyst for transformation. We have this possibility, and we can't just have it staying in these spaces. So what are we doing to move forward? It's a call to action. Let's unite around our guiding principles and move forward. Andy, pass it over to you to close.
So thank you. I think what that does, Trista, is really give us a question to go away with for everyone involved in this session. And that is not just what will other people do, but what will we change in ourselves as a result of this pandemic. And as this was going, I was kind of thinking, that I should probably ask myself that question as well. And I think, so I can mention two things. One is, I think I'll travel less. So there, you've heard it. So I think I'll travel less for the environment, and I think I'll travel less because of the relationships I value around me, as well as the relationships I value around the world. And I think I will, in my remaining years, devote a little more of my energies to the less developed economies or the emerging economies, as well as to the emerged and developed ones. And I'd ask everyone to, if you've not already asked yourself the question, to begin with asking yourselves that question before even it's projected onto other people. I want to thank everyone here for these 3 presentations of people with phenomenal public profiles and demands on their time, to give your time to all the participants here, to ICSI, to the field, and to the future. Thank you for doing this. Thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.